Hello Internet Travelers, and welcome to another installment of me talking about things that I learned in my introductory psychology class. In this video we'll be going over Chapter 9, which is the voyage through the lifespan. We're going to be talking about development starting from birth all the way to death. We're going to be covering it all and everything in between. Take a deep breath. Brace yourself. This is Psychology 101. Now, as always, it's best to get started by just defining exactly what it is we're going to be talking about today, which is lifespan psychology. Lifespan psychology is the study of the evolving behaviors and mental processes of an individual over the course of their life. There are different ways that they can develop and different processes that happen at different stages. We're going to break all those down a little bit and learn about each one. So lifespan psychology is all about tracking the different types of development in an individual throughout their life. And these different types of development are known as the domains of development. And we learned in class that there are 4 major domains of development. There's physical, cognitive, psychosocial, and moral. Physical development is all about the growth of our body and brain, as well as our motor skills and sensory capacity. One very early sign of physical development is the development of reflexes, which is involuntary movements to particular stimuli. This can be found as early as in infant stages. When you see a baby who has their hand out, if you put your finger in their hand, they'll automatically wrap their hand around your finger. That's an example of a reflex. It's part of the larger stage of physical development in an infant. Next we have cognitive development. This is all about the change and then relative stability in mental functions like learning, memory, language, thinking, moral reasoning, things like that. It's all about the mental processes. Then we have psychosocial development, which is measuring the change and then stability in personality, emotions, and relationships. And then last we have moral development, which is pretty straightforward. That's just growing up and understanding the difference between right and wrong. So those were the domains of development. Now we can talk about the different periods of development. These are the different life stages in somebody's life where all these different forms of development can take place. Now I know the whiteboard here looks very chaotic. Kind of got a cramped setup here, so I can't utilize the whiteboard space effectively, but we'll just quickly run through the best we can the different periods of development in a human's life. It starts with neonatal. This is the first period of development, and it is the first 4 weeks after birth. After that, it is infancy and toddlerhood. That's the next period of development. It is birth through age 3, followed by early childhood. This is from the years 3 to 6. Middle childhood, 6 to 11. Adolescence is 11 to 20. Emerging adulthood is considered 18 to 25. Early adulthood is 20 to 40. Middle adulthood, 40 to 65. And then last is late adulthood, which is considered anything 65 years or older. Now these aren't hard and fast periods of development, and you can see there's some overlap in some of them, like between adolescence and emerging adulthood, or between the emerging adulthood and early adulthood. These aren't hard and fast rules. It's just different periods or different types of development typically take place relatively within these sort of frames or guidelines. Now there are a couple different psychologists we learned about that are imperative to the study of lifespan psychology. They were Jean Piaget and Erik Erikson. And they're both known for their work in different parts of developmental psychology. Jean Piaget was the founder of the cognitive development theory, and he came up with terms and ideas like the schema, which describes a pattern of actions or mental structures that a child uses to acquire knowledge. A common example of this is a baby puts things in their mouths a lot when they're given a new toy or whatever. That is what he called the sucking schema. It is how babies process information. And so if you give a baby a new toy and it puts it in its mouth, The actual act of putting it in its mouth is what's known as assimilation, which is taking a new stimuli and using the existing schema to try to understand it. The existing schema in this case being the sucking. Now, as a baby gets older and develops a little bit more, it will engage in something that's known as accommodation, which is developing new ways to understand and process information. That's why when we're adults, we're not continually just putting things in our mouth to try to figure out what it is. That is accommodation. Now, Erik Erikson, on the other hand, was all about psychosocial development, and he believed that various stages in our life were associated with different stages of what he called psychosocial development. I'll give you a couple examples of what that looks like. In infancy, a stage of psychosocial development here is trust versus mistrust, meaning it is critical for the infant who has needs that they cannot meet on their own to be able to trust their caregiver to help them take care of those needs. A lot of the psychosocial development theories by Erik Erikson are all about kind of different battles between two concepts. So here it's trust versus mistrust. In adolescence, the psychosocial stage, he believes, is ego identity versus role diffusion. And he believes this because in adolescence, that is when a teenager really starts to understand who they are and what they stand for. And so that is how they try to figure out their ego identity. And if they have trouble figuring that out, or they can't for some reason, what happens on the other side is role diffusion, which is when they start scrambling down different avenues, trying to find things that they like or things that they can attach their identity to, and they end up just spreading themselves too thin and they never really figure out who exactly they are. Last example here is late adulthood, which is, again, ego identity versus despair. And it's kind of it's a much different battle here with their ego identity, because when you are over the age of 65, you have to start worrying about the fact that one day you are probably going to die. And people can become overwhelmed with despair, and they can get super anxious or super depressed, or they can maintain their strong ego identity and maintain that life is meaningful and worthwhile and still get the most out of it while they can. Naturally, if we're talking about child development, it would make sense to talk about different parenting styles and how they can influence the development of a child. We talked about 4 major types of parenting styles: authoritative, authoritarian, permissive, and uninvolved. An authoritative parenting style is when a parent provides firm but consistent guidance and consistent love and affection too. And children who are raised by authoritative parents tend to be competent, self-controlled, they're independent, and they're assertive. Authoritarian, on the other hand, we got authoritative and authoritarian. Authoritarian parents demand obedience to authority and are usually very cold emotionally. Children who are raised by authoritarian parents tend to be withdrawn, they're more apprehensive, and they have little to no curiosity, which would make sense if you're constantly being told you have to obey authority, you have to just do whatever you're told. You're not going to develop that sense of curiosity and wonder what else is out there, what else could I be doing, because that would be against the rules. Next, we have permissive parents. These are parents who are very warm, very affectionate, but they don't really enforce rules of any kind to their children, and they end up being the more spoiled brat type of kid. For any Mean Girls fans out there, think of like Regina George's mom, and that is kind of what the permissive parenting style is all about. Then last we have uninvolved, which is very simple, it just means the parent is not around. We didn't talk about that one too much. Now it's important to note that regardless of what type of parenting style somebody was raised in, it is not necessarily set in stone that the child is going to grow up to be a certain way as a result of the parenting style. It just means there are some statistics, there are some tendencies to grow up a certain way as a result. Parenting styles are one thing that can influence the development of a child. Let's take a look at something else that can as well. We learned a concept called temperament, which is a person's behavioral style or characteristic way of responding to the environment. And this is something that is sort of innate. It is what a child is born with. They're born with a certain temperament. And we learned that there are 3 different kinds. There's easy temperament, difficult temperament, and the slow to warm up temperament. They couldn't think of a better name for that last one. Anyways, the easy temperament is when a child is primarily positive, they smile easily, and they have a generally happy and positive disposition. Difficult temperament, on the other hand, is when a child is frequently negative, they withdraw from new situations, and they're very slow and very unwilling to adapt to change. Slow to warm up temperament, on the other hand, is somebody who has mildly negative responses to new stimuli or situations, but with repeated exposure will slowly develop a positive interest to the new stimuli or situation that they got put in. So one of the final kind of subcategories here that can influence development is this idea of attachment, which is just the bond, the emotional bond between an infant and their caregiver. And we learned that there are 4 different types of attachment that can be formed between these two people. First, there is the secure bond, which is if you were to put an infant in a room with their parent, they would be more willing to explore, to look around the room. They might touch base with the mom or the caregiver every now and then. And when the mother leaves, they do get upset, but they're easily soothed when the mom comes back. Avoidant attachment, on the other hand, is exactly what applies. They're sort of unattached. If you put one of these children in a room with their mom, they don't really have any fears about going around and exploring the room. They don't have to touch base every now and then, and they're not even particularly upset if the mom leaves the room for a moment. Now, ambivalent attachment, on the other hand, is a little bit more complex. The word ambivalent essentially means having mixed or contradictory feelings about something. So what does that look like in psychology with regards to attachment? Well, if a child has an ambivalent attachment to their mother, it typically means that they get very upset when the mother leaves, and then when they come back, instead of being easily soothed like somebody with a secure attachment, they get angry at the mom, and they might try to hit her or scream at her or something like that. That is ambivalent attachment. Now last is the disorganized or disoriented attachment. We didn't talk too much about this one, but it's generally described as when a child is just more generally fearful or dazed, or maybe even a little bit depressed if they're in a new situation and the mom leaves. They just are very confused and don't really know what to do or what's going on. We could spend hours talking about the different periods of development in lifespan psychology, but just for the sake of time in this video, we'll just talk about a couple and learn a little bit about what happens in each. And we'll start with adolescence, which is the time where things like puberty happen, and that is the period of physical development in which sexual reproduction first becomes possible. Some other things that happen in adolescence is hormone levels fluctuate kind of wildly, and this can affect mood, behaviors, and more. Some other stuff that happens is the synaptic connections in our neurons become more refined, and the gray matter in the brain increases. Without going too far down the rabbit hole, it'll suffice to say that this just helps increase the capacity for information processing in adolescence. One other thing worth noting about adolescent people is that their frontal cortex is not fully developed yet. That doesn't happen until the early 20s. And that is why you see teenagers often making poor judgments about things, or they maybe don't have the best insight or reasoning ability yet, because all that takes place in the frontal cortex. Alright, the next stage that we'll talk a little bit about is adulthood, because there are a lot of different changes and developments that happen in adulthood. One that we talked a little bit about in class that I thought was interesting was the idea of a midlife crisis. And we learned that this is a transition of identity and self-confidence that can occur usually between the ages of 45 and 65. Basically what happens is as physical and mental changes start to happen as somebody gets older, can cause reflection upon their own experiences in life and the accomplishments that they've had, which can cause really severe anxiety or depression in some people. One other important term that we learned about in the adulthood stage of life is the idea of the sandwich generation. And this is that period of adulthood, usually in their 40s or 50s, where an adult finds themselves where they're still taking care of their own children, but now they're at the point where they also have to take care of their own parents, who are now getting older and might need some assistance getting by. Okay, so since there are a lot of changes in adulthood, let's talk about some of the mental changes that occur. And it'll be best to start by just defining 2 different types of intelligences that are found in adults. there's the idea of crystallized intelligence, and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is sort of the collection of concrete knowledge that is obtained by somebody over time. For example, if you are a history professor, part of your crystallized knowledge will be all the different dates and historical trends that you have memorized over time as part of your work. It's all stored up here. That's part of your crystallized knowledge. Now, as you get older, your crystallized knowledge doesn't really change. In fact, it might even get stronger, because as you get older and you continue to learn and take in new information, you can add that to your collection of crystallized knowledge. Fluid intelligence, on the other hand, is a little bit different. Fluid intelligence is the mental flexibility to be able to quickly learn how to solve new problems that come up. And fluid intelligence is something that does decrease over time as you get older. Crystallized intelligence increases with age. Fluid intelligence tends to decrease with age. Now, one other mental change that does happen in adults is related to memory. Memory function does typically decrease over time, but it is usually not to the scale that most people would think of. And actually, a lot of memory loss can sort of be reversed through different lifestyle changes. If you work out more, if you're very physically active, and you maintain social connections with people, that can help ward off some of the memory loss problems experienced with old age. However, if you are one of the unlucky 1 in 10 Americans between the ages of 65 and 74, you may get diagnosed with Alzheimer's, which is an irreversible mental disease that slowly takes away all of the mental functions of everybody. This is memory, this is language, problem solving, and all other cognitive abilities. Okay, the last thing that we talked about as it relates to adulthood development is the idea of successful aging. And this kind of goes hand in hand with one of Erik Erikson's psychosocial developmental theories of ego integrity, meaning as you get closer to death, you don't panic about it, you still find life meaningful, and you can still get a lot out of your experience here. Successful aging and ego integrity kind of go hand in hand because they both involve similar things like regular physical exercise. I'll throw in one more term that I thought was interesting as it relates to successful aging, and that is selective optimization with compensation. It's a mouthful, but I think it's a really beautiful idea because it's all about, as you get older, you reshape your focuses in life to be on things that you find important and meaningful in the face of the physical declines that come with age and the potential cognitive impairments that come with aging as well. It's all about making the best with what you are still able to do. Well, that's just about all we covered in Chapter 9, which is all about lifespan psychology. In my next video, we'll be going over Chapters 11 and 12. It'll be another joint chapter video. Chapter 11 is about stress, and Chapter 12 is about psychological disorders, which is always a very popular one to learn about. It's super interesting. But before I go, I would like to read a poem by Sarah Teasdale. Sarah Teasdale wrote this. It's called There Will Come Soft Rains. There will come soft rains, and the smell of the ground, and swallows circling with their shimmering sound, and frogs in the pools singing at night, and wild plum trees in tremulous white. Robins will wear their feathery fire, whistling their whims on a low fence wire, and not one will know of the war, not one will care at last when it is done. Not one would mind, neither bird nor tree, if mankind perished utterly. And spring herself, when she awoke at dawn, would scarcely know that we were gone. I'll see you next time, everybody.